بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Inshallah, I'm going to try to run through this presentation. The topic that I'm going to be discussing here is the genesis of liberalism. Basically, the history of how it came about. So, what we're going to be looking at is the rise of liberalism, its precursors, its core principles, and we're also going to briefly touch upon where it has led us, if time permits us. I have perhaps the longest topic here tonight, which is I have to cover so many, maybe like 500-600 years of history, and there's so many ideas, counter ideas during that long history. So I'm going to try to go through each slide as quickly as possible and try to give just enough information for us to understand what's happening. So first, we're going to address the question of what is liberalism, and this is something that Mufti Tufail also talked about in his talk. So he defined liberalism in basically the political ideology of promoting the freedom, the equality, autonomy of an individual under a limited government. Now, liberalism has people have given many different definitions. What we're going to focus on in this sort of evolution of this worldview, we're going to focus a lot on basically on the idea of freedom and the idea of the individualism, the individual. Because these are both found in this definition, so we'll see this progression, and this is where we find a tension actually. So classical liberalism and its precursors. The very first iteration of liberalism historically was classical liberalism. Now, we have to talk, before we get into actual classical liberalism, I want to show you how liberalism breaks down. Initially, there was classical liberalism, which we can call old liberalism or liberalism 1.0 or first one, however we want to define it. What we live in today is a form of social liberalism. Okay, now social liberalism we're going to go into after we talk about classical liberalism to show that how liberalism came about. There was problems with classical liberalism, right? There was problems with it, and then there was a whole different movement of socialism on the side from continental philosophers, and from continental philosophy, the rationalists. That had influence on classical liberalism. There was a bunch of other things that happened, and we came to this, what we have social liberalism today. So now we're going to the precursors of liberalism, basically the precursors of classical liberalism, pre-Enlightenment thinkers and their ideas. So when we talk about liberalism, it didn't just, somebody woke up one day and said that, hey, I have a great idea, let's use it. But there is a whole bunch of ideas, ideologies, philosophies that were presented over time. We can say arguably, right up until from the 1200s, there was a lot of ideas that were starting to come up for different reasons. And classical liberalism, all it did was it kind of took and amalgamated all of those ideas together. So, first we have Thomas Aquinas in basically the 13th century. Now, what he did, the idea that he presented, now I'm just going to go through a few of them to show that these ideas actually do exist before liberalism. Liberalism only brings them all together, it compiles them together. So the first idea comes from Thomas Aquinas, and it's about, what he does is in his works, he makes a distinction between moral, natural law, and divine law. He says that there is a distinction, right? Basically, he says that the moral law that we have in Christianity, that treat others as you would like, do unto others as you would like done unto you, that this is a moral law that exists even in pagan cultures. So this idea that there is a law that doesn't have to be divine, this is a huge breakthrough, because what he's basically saying is that you don't need revelation. We don't need revelation. There are laws that exist separate from any kind of divine revelation that we could possibly achieve rationally. That we could possibly get to rationally. So he talks about that, and he presents that in his works. Then we have another idea in the 13 or 1400s by William of Ockham. I know probably some of us have heard of Occam's razor, right? I don't want to go into that, but what he talks about is the separation of church and state. So the idea of the separation of church and state, he actually brings this idea up. He floats this idea. And he actually says in his work, it's called A Letter to the Friars Minor and Other Writings of his. He says, for this reason, the head of Christians does not, as a rule, have power to punish secular wrongs with a capital penalty and other bodily penalties. What he's saying, in those days, the Christian church had a lot of power. They could actually go and arrest people and then hand them over to the authorities and even punish people. So he floats this idea, this is all the way back in the 13th century BC. He floats this idea that no, the Catholic Church or the church or religious authorities don't have this right. They don't have this right to, yeah, they can talk about immoral, right? And then if the state wants to, or the state will take their moral teachings and make that part of law. They will take the moral teachings and make that part of law. But the church itself doesn't have any authority to interject into political affairs or administrative affairs of the state. Another idea is, or another great, we can say, point, or a shifting point. It starts in the beginning of the Enlightenment in the 16th century. We have Michel de Montaigne. What he does is he's influenced himself by the works of Sextus Empiricus, who was an old Greek philosopher. He was famously known as like a skeptic. His work was translated into Latin. So Michel de Montaigne, he got access to his works, and he was influenced by it. So what he does is he transfers the skepticism, old Greek skepticism, and he brings it into his own works. He has these essays that he writes, 3 of them, and it's full of this Greek skepticism. So there's this newfound skepticism that's rising up in Europe, right? What is skepticism? Skepticism is basically, withholding any kind of knowledge, claim, or judgment. Yeah, you say that, I don't know if it's true. Is it, you question everything. This kind of skepticism, so this idea of skepticism begins to take hold. Other ideas are floating around, the separation of church and state. Moral law, is divine law really necessary? These ideas are now floating around in the society. Coming into Enlightenment, you have Thomas Helwys. He was actually a church priest. He was a priest himself. And he argues for freedom of consciousness, right? Freedom of moral judgment. That there should be no coercion in the life path you choose. Now, that Islam also, this is not a really a contentious point for Islam. Islam also agrees la ikraha fi din. You can't coerce anybody in deen. So this is not a big idea for Muslims, but for the Christians at that time, this was a big idea, right? Because they used to say that evil has no right, wrong has no right, so people would be killed and stuff. Coerced. I mean, we can look at the history of Spain and what happened in Spain, how many people were killed or even exiled. So this idea of Thomas Helwys is that there's no coercion. Let people choose their own path in life. Islam is a little bit different. Islam says that let people choose however they want to live. Yes, once a person becomes a Muslim, there are going to be certain responsibilities and certain duties that you have to up to. There is coercion after a certain level of coercion after a person is a Muslim, but he will not be coerced to believe. Okay, then there's Hugo Grotius in the Enlightenment thinkers. He took the idea that Thomas Aquinas had already presented earlier, that there exists a moral law separate from divine law, moral natural law, right? Basically, that morality can be deduced, without revelation. And what he does is he says that we should take that law, that natural law, deduce it, and then it should be made into law. That should be what governs societies and what governs the relationship between states. So he presents this idea. Again, we haven't gotten to liberalism yet. These are just individual ideas, but start to become famous, they start to take hold. So Grotius says that laws should be based on this natural law. Then we have John Milton. He presents basically the freedom of speech. He talks about the freedom of speech in his work. You know, the freedom of speech that everybody talks about now. There was no concept of freedom of speech in pre-modern this is a Enlightenment idea. And Islam is not entirely against it, but there is some, definitions and things need to be clarified. Limits need to be clarified. Okay. Again, there's John Winthrop. He discusses the idea of natural liberty versus moral liberty. Now, what he's saying is that you have the liberty to pursue, your actions, whatever actions you want to pursue. You should have the liberty to do whatever you want to do, but within the boundaries. So that itself is also not a, breakthrough idea. Everybody would say that. Muslims would say that. But this was something that was, very catchy, and people like this idea of being told that they're free to do whatever you want to do. Just don't break the law. But this will now grow, because what does it mean that you're allowed to do whatever you want? You have the freedom to pursue whatever. The idea is that the government cannot be sort of paternalistic, basically telling you what's best for you. In Islam, the government has a duty to make sure that every human being achieves the best for themselves in light of the Islamic teachings, right? To set a society limits and laws to guide a person to achieve the highest potential, spiritual potential. What he's saying is no, there shouldn't be anything like that. Follow the natural laws, let people pursue liberally whatever they want, whatever life path that they want. So you have the full liberty to pursue whatever makes you happy. Locke takes it a step further, okay, because he defines happiness as the pursuit of pleasure. Right? So you have the freedom to pursue happiness. Then that idea is taken first. Well, happiness means pursuit of pleasure. So you should have the full freedom to pursue all of those things which please you. And then they keep adding on to it, as long as you don't harm someone else, etc. It grows from there. And then we have Thomas Hobbes. He's probably the most notable of the Enlightenment thinkers. And previous reformers have argued that the church should not interfere with administrative affairs or implementation of laws. So as we mentioned, Grotius said that there should be a separation. The church shouldn't get involved in administrative affairs. What Hobbes does is that he says that the state, the king, the authority is a sovereign, and the sovereign is a leviathan. It has this all-encompassing power. If it wants to kill you, it can kill you. So what he said before, it was the church should not interfere in the state. He takes it a step further. He says the state is strong enough that it can interfere in the church if it wants. If the church decides that this, church teaching isn't good for this society, he can change it. He can get involved. He has that much power. So this is called secularism. Hobbes, he is the founder, or like the father of secularism, where the church there's a separation of church and state, yes, but the state has far more power than the church. All-encompassing power. And its power, Hobbes, explanation of it is like even if the state kills you or takes your wealth, it's free to do that. Now you might be thinking, why would he say that? Why would he come up with that idea? Because of his philosophy. He said that the state or government or political power should be based on human nature. But and he says that this is the scientific way of looking at it, establishing government. But the funny thing is that the human nature that he discusses has nothing to do with science. He talks about this mythical state of nature of man. So he said that every mankind or human beings initially, they were in this state of nature. It was every man for himself, right? And it was everyone against everyone, and everyone had the right to everything. Now in such a state, everybody's in danger. So they all came together, they made a social contract. Again, like I said, this is a mythical state. I don't think he believed that this time actually existed. But he said they came together, they made a social contract, and they gave over that freedom, that ultimate freedom of every man just has ultimate freedom to have anything he wants, they gave up that right and they gave that to be sovereign, the sovereign like a king. So this is called social contract theory. So he comes up with this social contract theory and secularism. I can't go too much. I mean, you could have a whole 2-3 courses on just Hobbes and all of his, details of it. Mufti Tufel mentioned his explanation of, what Hobbes had said with regards to colonization and how we should treat the, indigenous people after being colonized. What rights and rules do they have? And it's full of a lot of things that would be shocking to most people today. These are the fathers of the liberalist tradition, in the sense that these were the ideas that liberalism then. Okay, another big turning point. So there's, on one side we have these ideas that are floating around. These are just a few of them, there's others as well. We don't have the time to go into all of them, or else we could do the whole hour on just the ideas that were being, propagated during that time. We have other influences, social influences. So there's this, the rise of Protestantism. And basically Martin Luther in 1510, he challenges the Catholic Church. Okay? He takes up issue with the church, the church fathers. He sees them as being sort of like this intermediary between the people, the individual, and God. And he says that, what is this? And that time the church was doing things like selling indulgences. That was the main thing that irked him. And what is selling indulgences? The church would say that, okay, you give us this much money, and we'll give you basically a receipt that says that you've been forgiven for that sin. Oh, what sin did you commit? Okay, that'll be 10,000 silver coins. Okay, 10,000 silver coins, here you go, you're forgiven. So they were selling forgiveness, basically. So that and a bunch of other issues. So what he did is that he started to question. Remember, this is a time where skepticism was also, taking over. People were starting to ask. People were starting to question. So the authority of the church is now being questioned. And we will see that the questioning goes beyond that. First, the church fathers are questioned. Then the authority of the church is questioned. Then the Bible is questioned. Then God himself is questioned. Finally, they go away the idea of God. Right? So that's where skepticism, that's where it kind of leads. And it goes beyond that. Because then the principles they set down to replace God, even those are questioned. And then they break those. And it just keeps breaking down until we come to where we are today, where we don't know what words mean. Nothing means anything. Skepticism is like deeply ingrained. Now that's not to say that the Muslim society before this liberal society, they didn't ask questions. They were the ones who came up with a lot of Ibn al-Haytham and the history of how scientific method, hypothesis, and test it and see if it works, and So all of that, they actually knew about that. But this was the old Greek skepticism that got a revival and then it just went rampant. And people were questioning church authority before that, but around the time of Martin Luther, the printing press started. So these ideas were, so the printing press, they had a big, impact on the spread of Protestantism and then the rise of liberalism. So ideas were spreading faster. So the rise of a new sect of Christians against Catholic hegemony, Protestants advocate an individual relationship with God. Again, this move towards more individualism. Catholicism, Catholic actually means Jama'ah. They're like the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah of Christianity. So, and the Protestants they're like the breakaway. They say, no, we need to go back to the Bible itself, the text. We have our own relationship with God through the Bible. It's individualistic, right? We want to go back to the Salaf. That's what they were demanding. Obviously, the church wrote a lot of responses and things like that, and that's a whole other issue. So this wasn't a minor thing that, the church is just arguing with itself. No, it led to wars, right? So Europe was engulfed in civil wars, and it led to the 30 Years Civil War. And then there was even a civil war in England that lasted 10 years. And in some places in Germany, I mentioned it here, like in some places, up to 60% of the population was wiped out. Very, very terrible and bloody wars took place, internecine wars within Europe. Then there was the English Civil War, followed by the influence of the Whig Party. I'm skipping huge chunks of history here, by the way. But now the Whig Party, why is this important? Why is the Whig Party, and this has nothing to do with the hairpiece, by the way. This is it comes from Whiggamore. It was a pejorative term used for certain people that espouse a certain ideology. But anyway, so what happens is that the Whig Party eventually takes over in England. After all of these wars kind of settled down, there was like a truce and a peace treaty written. And one of the key leaders of the Whig Party was Anthony Ashley Cooper, and he was a patron of John Locke. Now, John Locke is a person, he doesn't really have a lot of new ideas, but what he does is he compiles all of the ideas and he turns it into a cohesive sort of philosophy. He makes a little tweak to Hobbes. That's why we call it liberalism, not secularism. Political liberalism is just secularism, but with minor tweak. And I'll tell you what that tweak is when we do Hobbes in a second. So he was Anthony Ashley Cooper, he was basically a patron. He was a supporter of John Locke. So all of John Locke's writings and philosophies they started taking it and it started becoming law. And not just in England, but all of the colonies of England, right? The Carolinas. In America, most of the American Constitution is, like, John Locke has heavy influence in the American Constitution. The idea of, liberty and freedom and this and that. A lot of these are John Locke's ideas. So that's why the Whig Party coming into power is important. You should read the history, it's really interesting. By 1689, the Bill of Rights in England and the start of liberal reforms. The Bill of Rights and liberal reforms is basically when now liberalism starts to become part of law. If we look at the Bill of Rights, it's basically a long list of freedoms, right? Freedom of speech, freedom to, the right to bear arms, taxation, kings cannot interfere in how we choose parliament members. All these freedoms are listed out in the Bill of Rights. So now liberalism takes a shape, takes a form, it becomes a thing. Classical liberalism. I have 33 slides. I'm looking at this. I'm losing heart. How much time do we have? Okay. Now the crystallization of classical liberalism, John Locke's ideas. So this was basically the tweak that he put on Hobbes' idea of secularism. Hobbes had said that the government is all powerful. It's the sovereign. It can do whatever it wants. So John Locke, what he does, and this is an interesting thing. What he does is that he has this quote which says that there's no injustice without property, without ownership or property. Right? In the next slide, without ownership. Right? So what he says is that how he works his philosophy is he kind of takes God out of the picture. And he says that man is the sovereign. Man is the sovereign. The man owns himself. He what? Man owns himself. Now in the Islamic paradigm, we don't say that. We say God owns all of us. Right? How do you own yourself? You can't own. You didn't create yourself. Right? They always say like, oh, you control your actions and this and that. But control doesn't mean ownership, right? So he said man is his own, he owns himself. So now, when he makes a contract with the government, it's a conditional contract. He gives some of that ownership to the government, but on the condition that the government protects his wealth and his life. So if the government doesn't fulfill those two conditions, then I no longer have to basically be under that government. Basically, I can revolt. That's where the idea of the right to bear arms comes from. That if the government isn't fulfilling its end of the contract, the social contract of Thomas Hobbes, with this tweak, it means that now I can stand up and I can revolt against the government. So he establishes the individual as a sovereign, meaning the supreme authority. Without property, there is no injustice. And the first thing every person owns is themselves. So man owns himself. This idea is the accepted principle within every single school of enlightenment until this very day. There's no school of enlightenment that believes otherwise. You own yourself. You get to choose and decide what's right and what you want to do. You have the freedom, right? No one can tell you what to do. We've heard these sayings. Well, these things come from this ideology, this idea that I am the owner of myself. No one can tell me what to do. Okay. So, and this is basically individualism also. This is what individualism has become. redefines happiness. He says that happiness is the pleasure following your pleasures, following your desires. Remember the old understanding of happiness from Plato and Aristotle's time, like when you start to philosophize and the philosophers, the happy person, etc. But now they're redefining it. They say, no, it's about material pleasure. Okay. So the core principles of liberalism, and again, this is something that is kind of accepted throughout all schools of enlightenment. Number one, that the supreme sovereignty of man as his own earthly master and property. Man's property precedes any social contract of government. This is another thing of liberalism. That wealth is primary. You own yourself, that comes first. Property comes first, and then the government is formed afterwards to protect that. So property comes first. Hence capitalism and all of that will come out of the liberal tradition. Necessity of limited government to protect and establish man's sovereignty. So this is his rejection of Hobbes' idea. Transfer of man's sovereignty to government by consent and contract. Now how do you give your sovereignty to the government? Like in Islam, you say Allah Ta'ala is the sovereign, and He gives authority to you. And then you come together and you give that authority to one person to enact Allah Ta'ala's laws and sovereignty. But in this liberal idea, is you are sovereign. You're like the God. And you give some of that over to all of you come together and you give that to the government on a conditional contract. On a conditional contract. And going back to basically the state of nature so that everyone is protected from everyone else. But it's a myth again, it's based on myth. Human beings never lived individually running around as beasts in the wild and then they came together and made a social contract. No, it's a myth. Human beings were, as far back as you can, they lived communitarian, like how Mufti Saab was mentioning just before in the last topic. I've always lived as communities. Okay, let me run through this quickly. Transfer of man's sovereignty to government by consent and contract. So how do you consent and how do you contract? Well, voting. Law actually says that when you vote, you consent to the authority of that government. That's why democratic governments are so bent on everybody should get out and vote, because that's how they get authority. That's how they get legitimacy. So he says any laws or restrictions must be justified according to the public good. I put the parentheses on the quotations on the public good, because that word right there is where they will this will be reinterpreted by whoever's in power. What is the public good? Depends on who's in power. Nowadays they call it national interest or security interest or whatever. The public good can be defined as anything. So right now, somebody can come and say that, well, the public good is that everybody should be allowed to use or be called by the pronoun that they wish to be called by. That's the public good. That's the public good then. Restrictions can be placed on you if that's how the public good is defined. This is one example, and you can ask after that. You can use analogy. So that was classical liberalism. Now we're going to talk about social liberalism. Social liberalism is a result of several also what we call it, advancements. So what happens first is we have David Hume. Hume comes, he's like a jackhammer that just comes and he breaks down a lot of these old ideas that helped, that classical liberalism was standing on. He comes like a wrecking ball and destroys many of them. He says the state of nature, what are you talking about, that never happened? Natural rights? Where do natural rights come from? It's nonsense. Well, Bentham would say nonsense on stilts, but the idea starts with Hume. Hume says that there's no such thing as natural rights. And it's funny because after Hume, no philosopher will use the argument of natural rights. And the only people that continue to use that argument is America, because by that time it was enshrined in the Constitution. So they never got to update it. So they still talk about natural rights. But David Hume had done away with natural rights. They had argued against it by that time, and nobody was using it anymore. He says this is nonsense. You go into nature and then, see if the animals will respect your natural rights. Tell the tiger that, don't bite me, I have, this right and that right. No, that's what do you mean by natural? Where do these natural rights exist? They don't exist anymore. You've just made them up. Especially if you're taking God out of the picture. That's what Hobbes did, right? Hobbes, he says, let's take a scientific approach, as I mentioned. Let's take a scientific approach, look at the nature of man, and then we can decide what kind of government we should have. Forget about God and what God has to say. Hume, he comes in, he's an Enlightenment philosopher, he hits the core of Enlightenment like a wrecking ball. You can see the wrecking ball too. Compliment to Moulana. State of nature and natural rights does not equal one. He had a very simple argument for natural rights not making much sense. He said nature tells us how things are, but not how things ought to be. Just because it is that way in nature doesn't mean it ought to be that way morally. Right? In nature, animals will fight and kill each other. That's how things are. Does it ought to be that way for us as well? So does not equal ought. Should. Ought, we don't use ought that much anymore. So does not mean should be. It just means that it is that way. He himself is an empiricist, but he brings like strong arguments against empiricism that you can even use against empiricists today. What are empiricists? Are those people who they approach knowledge from a senses-first approach, right? How do we know what we know? Well, through our senses. We learn things through our senses, which is not wrong, but it's not right either. You have these two schools. The rationalists, they say that the primary thing is the mind, our rationality, and you have the empiricists. They say that no, the primary thing is the senses. So they'll say that we sense things and that's how we gain knowledge. The rationalists, they respond to that and say, okay, you sense things, the information goes into your mind. Your mind is this blank slate. But then how does the mind know how to categorize those things? And how come everybody's categorizing information in the same way? Hot, cold, up, down. Everybody's categorizing this in the same way. So that means there's a pre-existing rationality. Right? So it's funny because it's such a minute difference of which one is like primary, but it has huge impacts on the direction of the philosophy that comes thereafter. The rationalists, that prevails in the continental philosophy. France, Germany, they become idealists and they end up coming up with socialism. And the empiricists, they're a little more cryptic, I guess you can say. They don't necessarily say that everybody's equal. They say, well, empirically, everybody's not equal. Well, let's just treat everybody equal. Whereas the rationalists, they'll say, no, everybody is literally equal because the mind comes first. Everybody's mind is the same. It's not even gendered. Okay? So you have this empiricist. So how does he attack empiricism? Even though he himself is an empiricist, he's not a rationalist. So he attacks empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism, he says that induction and causality are just assumed. He gives the example, I believe, of like two clocks. You have one clock in front of the other clock, and both of the hands are moving at the same time. Now you've seen the hand tick at the same time so many times that you just concluded that now this hand is causing that hand to move. He says, no, but what all you're seeing is just a pattern. What you're really witnessing is just a pattern, but it doesn't imply causation. Where are you getting that one is causing the other? Right? One atom is causing the other atom to do anything. Where is the connection? So this had big impact on the empiricists. They were like, yeah, well, he's kind of right. On the other side, the rationalists, they were talking about this rational. He said, no, there's no such thing as objective reasoning and thinking. Your reasoning is also a slave to your passions. Your sleeping is a slave to your passions. So it's not objective. Hume's attack continued. There it is. Humans fundamentally rational. What does he say? No, they're fundamentally irrational. Human beings aren't rational. They'll do things that rationalize what they want to. So they have this desire for something and then they'll rationalize it afterwards. So he's kind of like, he's not very, how would we say it, optimistic about humans, right? And so now, remember I mentioned in the beginning that natural rights, the idea of natural rights, it says that through your rationality, you can understand some natural rights that exist somewhere there in the ether, right? That's what natural rights is. Moral, what is moral? You can rationalize and come to a conclusion on what is moral. So when he breaks rationality, what he says is that what you're just claiming to be moral is just what you want to be moral. Passions. Yeah, well, so he's saying that if morality is based on rationality and rationality is based on your passions. So basically, morality is just based on what you want to be moral. So there is no objective natural law that's based on some natural morals out there. So now the Western tradition didn't have divine morals and they don't have this either. so Adam Smith, he writes about the free markets, and he says that the free market will basically change society in a way where it will benefit all the classes. The upper class will also benefit, the lower class will also benefit. He makes argument that this work for profit will also be more profitable than slavery. So slavery ended in the West, it wasn't because of like, you know what, getting back to these people. No, it was, you know what, if we pay people to work harder, they put more energy in, they'll put more effort in, it's more cost effective than owning a slave and you have to feed him and then he's dragging around on the field and not working properly. Rather just hire somebody for a few hours that will do work. So it's more profitable. That's what he argued. Number two, he argued against colonialism from this same angle. That listen, instead of going out and colonizing these huge swaths of land, it's taking all of our money and energy. Let them rule themselves, but what we'll do is that we will have to we will force them to keep their markets open. So we can trade. And since we're already rich and powerful, we'll have the upper hand in that. This is called neocolonialism, where you control things from afar. You don't have to be there. So I'm going to skip the actual slide and I'll go to at this time, there's the philosophers and the continental philosophers, Germany, France, and that area. So we have Rousseau. He's also around this time in the 18th century. He's a rationalist philosopher, and his ideas were that private property is the origin of inequality. Right? He sees where society has come to. People's tastes and preferences. Now, social problems brought about ideas from the rationalist camp that were far more extreme. Rousseau was considered a little more extreme. He argued that private property is the origin of inequality. Industry and technology are changing people's tastes and preferences. If it wasn't for these things, people would be good. He also argued that society is meant to develop a man to his potential and make him a more fulfilled human being. So what's the job of society? Now, it doesn't mean that he's promoting society or he's saying that society is this thing, that he's moving away from individualism. No, they're still individualists. The idea is that how can man be most free? What the rationalists say is that the man will be able to be most free by society's help. That's all, that's the only difference. Anglo-Saxon philosophers were saying that no, it's just every individual for himself, atomized. Right? As long as the less connections he has and is allowed to do what he wants, he's free. What the rationalists were saying that no, society has a big role to play in how free he can be. Right? And he had a lot to say about wealth and inequality. He said that this is human beings become bad, not on their own, but because of perhaps. Should I stop here or should I? Yeah, this is more like a history lesson. Some of you are already bored, but we're just going to continue, inshallah. So at this time, there's a French Revolution. Again, in France, the lower class people, prices had risen, so there was a revolution against the government. And Rousseau's ideas played a big role in that. Why am I mentioning this? It's because this line of thinking leads to socialism, and socialism influences then liberalism becomes social liberalism, which is the dominant worldview that we live in today. Social liberalism is what we live in today. So emergence of the socialist, what this does is when the French Revolution happens, then in the French Revolution, the people rise up and they start to dismantle all of the institutions, right? Any aristocrat, person of power, wealthy individual, they dismantle all of those institutions and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were beheaded in the name of liberty. Right? Sometimes we have this notion that, the West came to liberty with, free and fair elections and everybody was loving it. No, it's actually revolts, revolutions. Even John Locke, the Whig Party, they had like 3 revolts, people were killed. Then you have the French Revolution, and thousands of people are killed in the name of liberty, equality, liberté, all of that. So what happens is that classical liberalists, so Edmund Burke, he's looking at what's happening in France at this time, and he sees that these institutions are being broken down. Now remember, the idea of natural rights is based on nothing at this point. So he says that, listen, everybody needs to relax. We don't need to go the way of the idealists, the rationalists, the mind first people. They have this idea and they want to implement that idea onto society right away. What he says is that a lot of the freedoms and things that we have are rooted in our traditions, in our institutions, and in our traditions and our institutions like the church, the aristocracy, all of these things. Our freedoms that we have and all that we have actually stem from these things. So these things should be preserved. And there we have the conservative parties born. So now what's the difference between the conservative and the social liberals? The conservatives are saying that, great, we would like to see things move in this direction, but let's take it slowly. Even today, the conservatives are just 10 years behind where the liberals are. So like in the next 10 years, what the liberals are saying today, the conservatives will be saying. They just want to take it the natural route. Let society, as traditions change, as institutions change, then those ideas will take over and let it happen that way naturally. The drastic measures, or the drastic way that it was done by the French revolutionaries, that's dangerous. Look how many people were killed. It was a bloody revolt. Okay. So the French Revolution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, of the Citizen, is drafted and ratified in 1789. Remember, Americans helped in the French Revolution because France had helped America against the English, the British. So society needs to be rebuilt on the social contract theory of Rousseau. He had a whole social contract theory again based on his ideas of what society meant to do for the individual. Okay. Burke and conservatism, I just kind of covered that. He's the father of modern conservatism. So he said the formulaic view of continental rationalism is not empirically sound. Liberty is the creation of social institutions. If we want to preserve liberty, preserve the institution that gave you liberty in the first place. That's what he's saying. Okay. Now, Edmund Burke, he said that we will get our rights and freedoms and all that. We will root it in our traditions and institutions. That was one response to Hume. Remember though I said that what are you talking about afterwards? Then another response to Hume, Kant, Immanuel Kant. Now Immanuel Kant is this door. He's a door. This door that gets open will lead to existentialism, postmodernism, and structuralism. All of you can almost say like the issues we have today, he opens the door for it. Now let's go into how he does that. Seems like we're getting into the good stuff now. Okay. So before him there was Hume, there was Rousseau, and Burke. So Immanuel Kant, he made an attempt to ground ethics on a basis outside of natural rights. He said, okay, forget about natural rights. Let's base ethics and morality in something other than natural rights. So he came up with the categorical imperative, and I believe one of the other speakers will be talking about the categorical imperative and the Bentham's idea of pleasure and pain, utilitarianism. So what is the categorical imperative? So while trying to defend classical liberalism and refute Hume and atheists as well, with a new basis for morality, he developed the categorical imperative, which basically says that ethics is based on doing. That stated that an individual must act in such a way as to make the principles behind their actions universal to everyone. Now, mind you, I'm going to be getting a little philosophical for a moment here. I just want to explain this idea, and I think we probably have to stop after this due to the time constraints. So, what is it? So, he says that the will of every person. So, how does he do it? Why do we have duty? It stated that an individual must act in such a way as to make the principles behind their action universal to everyone. So that if I do something, I should be willing to make what I did a universal law, that it should be followed. So for example, if I lie, then I should be willing to make that a universal law that everybody should lie. Right? Now, if everybody lies, then the idea of lying itself is put into question. So that it's contradictory. There's internal contradiction. So what happens? He says that he explains it through, he comes from his idea of transcendental freedom. So what is transcendental freedom? He says that every person has a will, right? Every person has a free will. Now remember, he's responding to Hume, who was an empiricist as well. So he says that, listen, every person has a free will, and the free will, why is it free? Hume had said that you're not free. Your rationality, your mind is actually a slave to your passions. So he says, no, your mind is free. Your will is free. Why? Because he divides reality into two segments. He says there's the physical world, which he calls the phenomena, and then there's this transcendental world, the universals, which he says is the noumena. He says your will, it resides in the noumena. And it's completely uncaused. So human beings are, in Islamic terminology, say, khaliq al-af'al. He creates his own actions. And his will is uncaused. So it is like the supreme power. It is the supreme power. And that is something amazing. So basically he took the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he gave it to human beings unwittingly. He was just trying to refute human, but he opens this door. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that has the وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. What is he saying? He's saying, no, you have a will that is uncaused by anything else. Yes, it's sensitive to the physical world, but it's uncaused and it has the ability to create ideas and all of that. Oh man, this opens the door. And when this will is so powerful, then it's something to be respected. That's why you have a duty to every other person who has a will. That's why if you're going to do anything, you should be willing to do it so that it becomes a universal law and applies to everybody. Categorical imperative. So he comes with this falsafa, this philosophy here. I won't go too much more into it. I don't know if maybe the other speaker will go into it a little more. Bentham says that, no, okay, listen, Hume has destroyed the idea of natural rights, so we'll have to base morality in something else. He says base it in the idea of pleasure and pain. Right? Whatever brings you pleasure, that's good. Whatever brings you pain, that's bad. That's the simple formula. Obviously, it's not that simplistic. There's others that came after him, after Bentham, like John Stuart Mill. He developed the idea further. And that's actually the prevailing idea of morality in today's world, right? Which is basically what we call the harm principle, or the greatest benefit. That what is moral? Moral is that thing which creates the most amount of happiness, right? I may be putting it a little. So. Maximizing pleasure and reducing pain for individuals. This will become the major cornerstone for social liberal ethics. Bentham famously referred. So he agreed that natural rights is nonsense on stilts. So I'm going to stop here. I don't want to run. We have about 10 slides left. So the idea of the will leads to Hegel's dialectic. Okay. So we're going to skip a few hundred years of developed philosophical thought in the middle, and I just want to mention like how it's relevant today. So look, when you make your will your God, right? It's got to be accepted, and it has the power to create. When it has the power to create. That's why Nietzsche would come later and he's like, what are you talking about, Kant? Your will doesn't have any duty to anyone else. The only thing that is, your only objective in life should be your will to power. How much effect you can cause from your will. And then this leads into something called existentialism, where your essence is primary, right? Because your will is you, it's your existence. And then after that, you create your attributes. So when you marry those two ideas, that your will has this power to create, and your essence is primary, you marry those two ideas, then it says that, okay, first you're born a human being, after that, or first it's you exist, existentialism, you exist, and then you can decide what attributes you want. So I can wake up tomorrow and say, I'm a female. And that's perfectly valid, because your will has the power to create. And everybody has to agree with it. That's because you are living your authentic self. That's the authentic expression of your will. Right? The old thing for social liberalism was that, be the best in your society, or achieve your full potential. That means that society has a goal for you, and now you should work to achieve that potential, or achieve that goal. But now what this new idea is saying is that no. Society, nobody gets to set goals for you. Your will has the power to create. Your will set a goal for itself. And you achieving that goal is you living your authentic self. So that's where the problem is now we're living in today. See how the idea kind of comes down to a cultural level. And it goes even down to a linguistic level. Right? Tying into Marxism. Marxism, we skipped all that history in the middle. I can't explain the zeitgeist and all of that. But okay, you get the idea. When you've given the world that much power, and I'll just close off with this at the end of this. Look at that, beaches. I want everybody to focus on this ayah, which I brought at the end basically. It says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. So then do you not see the one who has taken his ilah, his God, as his hawa, his desire? Right? You take Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the picture. You want to be God. وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ. These philosophers were not unintelligent men. They wrote tombs, they wrote huge philosophies just to get through dense, texts. They were not stupid. But أَضَلَّهُمُ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala misguided them with their ilm. Why? Because they took out the basis for ilm, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you take Allah out of the picture, that's what happens. That's what the ayah we said in the very beginning, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They have full knowledge of the physical world. وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ غَافِلُونَ. وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ وَخَتَمَ عَلَىٰ Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَخَتَمَ عَلَىٰ سَمْعِهِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَجَعَلَ عَلَىٰ بَصَرِهِ غِشَاوَةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that his eyes and his ears, which are sensory, meaning the empiricists, that's what they said is a source of knowledge. Qalbi, the rationalist, they're taking knowledge through all of these sources. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put a block. They never get to the truth. Because these aren't only two sources of knowledge. What's the other source of knowledge? Wahi. They deny wahi. So the empiricists, the rationalists, they're not getting the full picture. Most of them are getting the full picture. You're using your senses also, your rationality also, and you have wahi also. If you're only using those avenues for ilm, who's going to guide you if there's no Allah? Who's going to give you wahi? This is the question for us as Muslims. That will we not take a lesson? Are we still going to continue to follow this line of thinking? What I can see, what I can rationalize? Or are we going to submit to wahi as well? This is the question. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always understand what we want. I don't know if we have time for questions, and I don't know if anybody has questions. This is really more like a history lesson. If you have questions about dates and things like that, inshallah we can provide them. But inshallah we invite everyone to go ahead and have snacks and refreshments, inshallah. We'll continue, inshallah, in the session. 5:50, 5:30, inshallah.